Imagine being born already owing money, not metaphorically, not society owes something. Literally, before you take your first breath, before you speak your first word, a portion of your future labor is already promised to creditors you will never meet, contracts you never signed, and decisions made decades before you existed. Here's the mystery most people never question. Governments rise and fall. Empires collapse. Currencies are replaced. Leaders change every few years. Yet the debt never disappears. It survives wars, revolutions, defaults, and even so-called resets. Every generation is told the same story, that this debt is necessary, temporary, and under control. But what if that's not true? What if perpetual debt bonds are not a mistake, not a crisis, not a failure of policy, but a deliberate design? And what if future generations aren't citizens in this system, but collateral? To understand this, we need to rewind to a time when debt was feared, not celebrated. For most of human history, debt was recognized as socially dangerous. Ancient civilizations understood that if debts piled up endlessly, society would fracture. In Mesopotamia, rulers regularly declared debt jubilees, wiping the slate clean so farmers wouldn't be trapped in permanent bondage. In ancient Rome, excessive debt concentration fueled unrest, riots, and ultimately the fall of the Republic itself. Debt, back then, had limits. Rulers knew that allowing creditors to dominate society was a recipe for collapse. So debt was treated like emergency medicine, useful in crisis, deadly if abused. That understanding began to change in the late 1600s. England was locked in constant warfare. Armies, navies, and empire building required vast sums of money. Raising taxes risked rebellion. Seizing property risked instability. So a radical idea emerged. What if the government borrowed money instead, not temporarily, but indefinitely? In 1694, the English government struck a deal that would quietly reshape the world. Private lenders would loan large sums to the state. In return, the government would pay interest forever, not repay the loan, just service it. This was the birth of long-term and perpetual government bonds. At first, it looked like genius. The government got immediate funding. Lenders got guaranteed income. Citizens were told the debt would be managed over time. But something profound had changed. For the first time, governments realized they never needed to actually eliminate debt, as long as they could roll it over, refinance it, and pass the burden forward. Debt stopped being a temporary tool and became permanent infrastructure. Once this door opened, it could never be closed. As financial markets matured, governments learned to issue more bonds, longer durations, with increasingly abstract promises. Central banks emerged to stabilize the system, not by eliminating debt, but by making sure it could always be expanded safely, at least on paper. Each crisis reinforced the same lesson. Borrowing was easier than reform. Wars were no longer limited by available gold or current tax revenue. They were financed by future citizens. Infrastructure wasn't paid for by today's savings, but by tomorrow's income. Social programs expanded without corresponding productivity gains, funded by debt that would outlive the politicians who approved it. This is where cause and effect begins to compound. When governments discovered they could borrow without repayment, spending stopped being constrained by reality. Politicians could promise benefits now and defer the costs indefinitely. Voters were rewarded today. The bill was sent to the future, and that future kept moving. Over time, debt stopped representing past emergencies and started representing normal operations. Budgets assumed deficits. Borrowing became routine. Balanced budgets were reframed as outdated or even dangerous. Then came the breaking point, not a single collapse, but a slow structural shift. As debt grew larger than productive capacity, governments faced a choice: default openly or default silently. Open default would destroy trust overnight. Silent default, however, could happen invisibly through inflation, currency devaluation, and financial repression. This is where perpetual debt truly reveals its power. By inflating the currency, governments reduce the real value of what they owe, while citizens pay the price through rising living costs. By keeping interest rates artificially low, savers are punished while borrowers, especially governments, are rewarded. By expanding money supply, the system survives, but only by transferring wealth upward and forward in time. The debt doesn't disappear. It mutates. And future generations inherit the consequences. They inherit higher taxes to service interest. They inherit weaker currencies. They inherit inflated asset prices that lock them out of housing and stability. They inherit reduced public services as more revenue goes to debt payments instead of infrastructure or opportunity, all without ever consenting. This is the enslavement mechanism most people never see. Slavery is not chains. It's obligation without consent. It's labor extracted to service promises you didn't make. When a government issues perpetual debt bonds, it is effectively pledging the future labor of unborn citizens. Those citizens cannot vote against it. They cannot refuse the contract. They cannot renegotiate the terms. They can only work. History shows what happens when this reaches its limits. Empires overloaded with debt either collapse or reset. France's debt crisis fueled revolution. Weimar Germany tried to inflate its way out. Modern states quietly do the same, just slower and more sophisticated. And every time leaders promise fixes, they promise austerity, but rarely cut the structures that cause the problem. They promise growth, assuming tomorrow will always be richer than today. They promise reforms, but never question the permanence of debt itself. The failed fixes always follow the same pattern. It's more borrowing to fix borrowing, more stimulus to repair distortion, more complexity to hide instability. Central banks step in as buyers of last resort, absorbing government debt onto balance sheets, transforming sovereign debt into monetary expansion. The system doesn't heal, it extends. Now look at the present. Modern governments carry debts that exceed annual economic output. Entire generations are told they must accept lower living standards because there is no money even as trillions are created to stabilize markets. Pension systems rely on returns that assume perpetual growth. Housing markets are propped up by cheap debt that never normalizes. The pattern repeats globally. Different countries, same structure, same outcome. Perpetual debt bonds ensure that no generation ever truly starts free. Every generation inherits obligations before opportunity. Every generation works longer for less real ownership. Every generation is told this is normal, but it's not inevitable. Right? The most dangerous lie in this system is that debt is neutral, that it's just numbers on a spreadsheet. Debt is power. It determines who controls the future. So what are the takeaways? First, government debt is not abstract. It represents real claims on future labor, productivity, and freedom. When debt becomes perpetual, those claims never expire. Second, systems that rely on endless rollover rather than repayment inevitably shift costs to those least able to resist future generations with no political voice. Third, inflation, low interest rates, and financial complexity are not solutions. They are coping mechanisms that quietly enforce the same outcome: silent default through reduced purchasing power and opportunity. Here's the warning. A society that normalizes permanent debt normalizes permanent obligation, and a society that mortgages its future eventually loses the ability to choose it. The open question is not whether the system can continue. It can for a long time. The real question is how much freedom will remain by the time people realize what they inherited. If this changed the way you think about government debt, share it. If you want deeper breakdowns of the hidden systems shaping your future, subscribe. And next time someone says, "We'll pay it off later," ask the real question: who is we and who is later?